Welcome back to Kings of the North. Doug Lesmerises, and I'll be joined by a very special guest in just a bit, Scott Dochterman of The Athletic, national college football writer, great knowledge about the Big Ten, great knowledge about Iowa football. And he's coming on because we are saying a farewell to the Big Ten West. So it's dead. And the Big Ten is going divisionless, just like everybody else in college football. Many others already had. And so we want this show to be, this is like if you're a fan of Purdue and Illinois and Wisconsin and Northwestern and Nebraska and Minnesota and Iowa and everybody that was in the Big Ten West, like this is like a last look back. I'm going to have some superlatives at the end. This 10-year run of the Big Ten West existence from 2014 to 2023. Who was the best single team? Who was the best coach? Who was the best player? Who was the best quarterback? What was the best win? I have a couple superlatives like that at the end, but we want to provide some context here. So we have about a half an hour interview with Scott Dochterman talking about the realities of the Big Ten West, the perception of the Big Ten West. Was it a bad idea to even form the Big Ten West after the legends and leaders? Is debacle the right word? It was so pretentious. So when Nebraska joins the Big Ten, if you're watching this and you're not a hardcore Big Ten expert, Nebraska joins the Big Ten for the first time. The Big Ten goes to divisions for 2011, 2012, and 2013, but they try to divide it up based on, how good teams are and splitting teams up. They don't do it geographically, which I think is maybe a decent idea, but they named the divisions legends and leaders, which people just mock for 3 years. So then when they add Rutgers and Maryland in 2014, they say, let's just go west-east, and then we create a world where Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State are in the East, and the West has maybe a high floor, but no top dominant team. And it just creates this world where the Big Ten West gets set up and also sets itself up for national mockery as well. And so Scott and I have a good conversation about how that happened, why maybe it was never as bad as people thought. And then we have a couple of the Big Ten West writers from that period who are going to join us. Now that we're going to a divisionless world where the Big Ten is adding 4 teams, it's going to be 1 through 18, and the 2 best teams are going to play in the Big Ten title game in Indianapolis. Is this a better or worse reality for the former West teams? We have a Northwestern writer to talk about that. We have a Minnesota writer. It's Matthew Shelton talking Northwestern, Ryan Burns talking Minnesota, and Zach Heilprin talking Wisconsin. Is it better or worse for them? We asked Scott, is it better or worse for Iowa? But I also want to take this conversation beyond the Big Ten West, and I want to talk about the idea of the sport, college football generally, going away from divisions. And are we sure that divisions are bad? Because there is another segment we're going to do later in this show where there is something that I'm a little bit worried about with the College Football Playoff Committee. And I think sometimes it has not been the worst thing for a conference title game to not be between your 2 best teams. That actually you just separate the teams and you've got to win your part, and then you earn it based on those parameters. And I actually think we are going to be in a little bit of a weird spot in college football in a world where all the conferences now are just going to say, we're going to play our top 2 teams in the conference title game. And often, at least with the SEC and Big Ten, both those teams are going to make the playoff, win or lose, because the top 2 teams in the SEC and the Big Ten are going to get in no matter what. Now, you are playing for a bye because the 4 byes in the 12-team playoff are going to be the 4 best conference champions. So the second place team in the SEC might be the second best team in the country, can't get a bye. Second best team in the country could be the second best team in the Big Ten, can't get a bye. I also think some years you're going to say to yourself, well, the 2 best teams in the Big 12, they're both going to get in. So we are going to create a world where they're playing for seeding, which is something. They're playing for a bye, which is something, but they're not playing to get in or not. But there is one particular thing that I'm worried about. And I did some research, and we'll talk about that later in the show, where I think the committee has a chance to screw this up if it's not careful when it comes to how you evaluate conference title game losers in the 12-team playoff world. So I have a little bit of information from the past that will work into there. You want your 2 best teams to play, But when you were in a world where you had divisions and everybody in a division is playing every other team, you were guaranteed that your two best teams would play. It maybe just wouldn't be in the conference title game. So when you had Ohio State, Michigan, they're in the same division. They're guaranteed to play. It's just not going to be the last week of the year. But we call it a de facto title game, right? So you entered a world where when you did it that way, like for instance, when you didn't have divisions, 2002, Ohio State and Iowa are both 8-0 in the Big Ten, but it's one big division. There's no conference title game, and they didn't happen to play each other that year. That's a bad scenario. But I do think, I don't know. I'm not sure the divisionless world is the best thing. And I just think we all have to be careful with it. So that's one point that I want to talk about later. As we say goodbye, I also wrote a song. No, I didn't write a song. Elton John wrote a song. And I have been messing around with lyrics to Candle in the Wind for my song, Conference with the West. And I've been in my house saying to myself probably 200 times in the last week, goodbye, Brian F. That's how I would start it. You know Brian F. is, right? Goodbye, Brian F. But I can't really get it synced up with the karaoke music. I've been doing a lot of Googling karaoke version of Candle in the Wind. I do have the chorus down. So I think I'm going to sing you the chorus by the end. And then you can just implant that in your brain and then just put that with your own Big Ten West memories. Isn't that nice? You know, since it's dead. But part of the other conversation here is every major conference has a dominant division and a lesser division. And the Big Ten West was the worst example of that. But I don't want to talk about the Big Ten West as a complete outlier. I mean, like they were the worst, but like it's not the only one. They're like the worst example of a trend. So when you look at the world where the old Power 5 conferences did have divisions, every one of those conferences had a dominant division and a lesser division. The SEC, the West, went 19-13 against the East. That's a .594 winning percentage. The ACC, the Atlantic, this is in conference title games. The ACC, 12-5, the Atlantic over the Coastal. That's a .706 winning percentage. The Big 12, now this is a while ago because the Big 12, when they came back and started having a conference title game again, they went divisionless and they were the two best teams. But prior to that, back when Nebraska was still in the Big 12, it was the South was 11-4 against the North in the old Big 12 title games. That's a .733 winning percentage. The Pac-12, which last year in its final year went to divisionless, but before that, 9-2, the North over the South. That's an .818 winning percentage. And of course, the Big Ten, 10-0, the East over the West. Won every single game. So what's in common here? This is something that Scott and I are going to talk about a little bit later. But what happens is there often is a single dominant team that when you have a division structure is going to throw it off regardless because there's only one of them. So when you think about the SEC West 19-13, that's Bama. Now, Georgia did come along a little bit and perked up a little bit. Florida was there for a while. You know what Georgia never did in an SEC title game? Beat Alabama. How's that for a stat? We think Georgia's the new Alabama. Okay. So 19-13, but there was a run there where Bama was kicking everybody's butt. So what happened? Bama's in one division. They're going to throw it off. The ACC, that dominance, that's Clemson and Florida State in the same division. And then it's like Virginia Tech and teams like that in the other division trying to keep up. They can't because Clemson and Florida State together, and it's mostly Clemson later on, dominant. Okay, it's thrown off. What was it in the Big 12? It was that Nebraska was supposed to be the good team in the North back in that era. They were starting to fall off, and Oklahoma and Texas were in the South. And Oklahoma and Texas were dominant, and that means that the South, I think, was 11-4, I think it was, against the North in the Big 12. And then what happened in the Pac-12? USC fell off. That's Oregon dominating. That's Oregon dominating that era 9-2. So this is what happens. And so the same thing happened in the Big Ten with Ohio State's dominance and then Michigan's dominance later on. So Ohio State, Michigan dominated, but that's kind of the way it was set up. And there is a part of it when you have those two best teams. If you say in this world, Clemson and Florida State are going to play in the regular season every year, the winner of that game is going to be on track to win that division and then go and be the favorite in the conference title game. I actually don't think that's a terrible world. And that actually maybe makes more sense in a 12-team playoff than a 14-team playoff. But the point is that you had those teams playing. At some point, you controlled your own destiny where the best two teams played each other. It just wasn't at the end. But why does it have to be at the end? This is sort of fabricated, the idea of a conference title game, because what actually happened is I don't know that those teams, the very best teams, don't really care about conference titles that much. So the idea of like, hey, we won the conference title. It's winning the conference title sets you on the path to do what you really want to do, which is go compete for a national title. So whether Ohio State, Michigan play in a Big Ten championship or play in the regular season, they just have to play. Oklahoma and Texas just have to play. They do. You have to want to set up a world where Alabama and Georgia can play. You could do that by having same divisions or having them cross over and then play in a title game. That's fine. Washington and Oregon have to play. But now what you're doing is you're guaranteeing that if they're the two best teams, they're going to play at the end, which I think everybody thinks like, okay, that's better. And it's like, I don't know, because you're also setting up a circumstance where sometimes they're going to play twice, where what you were doing before is your two best teams, if you did it this way, were less likely to play twice. Because yes, there were some crossover games. So maybe Alabama, Georgia would play twice. If they played a crossover game in the SEC, they're in opposite divisions. Then they could play in the title game. But if you had two teams who were the two best teams, Ohio State and Michigan, when they're in the same division, they're never going to play twice. And like, that's okay. I think that's more okay than we think. They have to play once. But are you sure you want them to play twice? And this is where it's going to get a little bit dicey because the committee is going to have to think about this the right way. Because if they think about it the wrong way, conferences could be setting themselves up for that Big Ten, for that conference title game loser to get unfairly penalized in a way that's bad for the conference. We'll talk about that later. But anyway, the bottom line is if you think the Big Ten West stunk, you're not wrong, but other divisions stunk too. That's the shirt. Big Ten West stunk, and on the back, but other divisions stunk too. But nobody got the heat that the Big Ten West did. And as Scott makes the point, man, get over the hump one time. I got a stat for you, by the way. Do you know how many times the Big Ten West led at halftime in the Big Ten championship game out of 10? 4. Pretty good. Do you know how many times the Big Ten West had the higher ranked team going into the Big Ten title game? It's not 0. 3 straight years. 2015, 2016, 2017. 3 straight years. The Big Ten West team was ranked in 9 of 10 years. They were ranked 13th, 4th, 6th, 4th, 21st, 8th, 14th, 13th, and 16th. And then in 2022, they were unranked. But it's not like they were putting an absolutely horrible team out there. Now, the Big Ten East team every year was in the top 10 and often was in the top 5. 5th, 7th, 8th, 6th, 1st, 4th, 2nd. So, okay, we get that. There's a difference. They were closer than you thought. They never got over the top. And that's why it affected our perception. And now, as we said before, they're dead and they're gone. And how are you going to remember them? So this is a, if you're a college football fan, you've heard of the Big Ten West. You've made fun of the Big Ten West. This is providing a last little dose of context, but I also want to make sure we keep that division discussion on our mind. Scott Dochterman is next. We're so excited to have him here on Kings of the North. Joined now by Scott Dochterman of The Athletic. I don't want to call you the father of the Big Ten West, this is why I wanted to have you on and talk about the Big Ten West. I think if somebody decided I'm going to write a book about this 10-year period of the Big Ten West, I think it would be you. Have you considered it? You got a book in you?
I do have a book in me, but it wouldn't be about the Big Ten West. I think,
I would read it.
He would read it. Well, I'm sure after 2 or 3 pages, he'd probably say, okay, this is good and good for me, the insomniac. I'm out for a few hours, then open it up and then We could read about the 9-6 Iowa Illinois game with with all field goals. But so
Okay.
I don't think I'll.
No, but we'll do a 15-minute interview instead. Is that otherwise? This is filling in for the book. So we're going to talk a little bit about Iowa at the end, because you've covered Iowa football for so long, but obviously you cover so many other things at The Athletic and do a great job of it. As we look back now on the Big Ten West, was the Big Ten West a good idea? This is coming out of Leaders and Legends, where they tried to divide the Big Ten up by, mix up the best teams, and they did that for 3 years. Now they decide, okay, Maryland and Rutgers are coming in. Everybody makes fun of the Leaders and Legends names. Let's just go West and East. Was it a bad idea from the start, or did it make sense to be like, yeah, geography is geography, man. Let's do it this way?
I thought it made sense in the very beginning. And here's a couple of reasons why at that time. You can't look at it now and judge it. You have to look at it based on 2013, when all this was decided. You had the situation in Penn State, the Sandusky issue, where you had 4 years of bowl bans, money going. They couldn't receive any bowl money. And they were also, we didn't know how bad Penn State was going to be from this. I mean, really, to do what they did was remarkable in hindsight. You also look at Michigan and what Michigan was with Rich Rod and Brady Hoke, and they had one decent year in about a 5 or 6 year period after Lloyd Carr. And you look at that, and then you can combine that with the Big Ten West. Wisconsin had won 3 straight Big Ten titles, one of which was with Ohio State and Michigan State there. Iowa had been very competitive. Nebraska was in a much better position at that time, and it kept rivalries intact. I mean, as long as the Indiana-Purdue rivalry was able to be played, and nobody had an objection to that, it was good. And, and then there was times where you thought, well, maybe Michigan State should head west competitively, just to make sure, give it that buffer at that time. And it came down to Michigan State was going to be able to do that because they wanted to play in Chicago. They had really good series in the Legends divisions with Iowa and with Wisconsin and the championship games. And I mean, that first year of the championship game, that was phenomenal. Maybe the best championship game we've seen yet. D'Antonio had them rolling. And I always thought at that time, well, hey, if you have Michigan State, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Nebraska, maybe even Northwestern, whoever wins that's going to be competitive in Indianapolis. And then you have the other side. But how would that have impacted Ohio State, especially in the 14 year in the first year? Mm-hmm. If Michigan State was in the West, maybe they don't get to play Michigan State, or maybe they do and it's only in Indianapolis and they don't get that extra entry point, data point, and they're 5th. They don't even get to the playoff. So keeping Michigan State in the East. And then you saw Jim Harbaugh go to Michigan, and you saw James Franklin be able to elevate Penn State. Whereas in the West, you saw some floundering. Nobody could have predicted Nebraska would have fallen as far as they have. I mean, they're the only team in the country to not go to a bowl game since 2016. Wisconsin went from being a perennial 10-win team to a 7-win team. Iowa's been pretty consistent, has been the most consistent of the West, but not really, especially offensively in the last couple of years, hasn't really elevated itself to that level. And we saw the first couple of championship games, other than the Wisconsin-Ohio State game, but Iowa-Michigan State goes down to the end. Ohio State plays Wisconsin a couple of times, and it was really competitive. Penn State plays Wisconsin, really competitive. So it was just a matter to me of, I thought it was the right move at the right time. But in retrospect, we look at it and we always knew the East had a higher ceiling, but then they've consistently met that ceiling, where the West has kind of had a lower ceiling, and really only Iowa has been the most consistent team in the West.
We can just blame Nebraska, right? I think there's a big argument here. If Nebraska had wound up sort of doing in the last 10 years what Penn State did, if Nebraska was Penn State and Penn State was Nebraska, Ohio State, Michigan are still going to do their thing. I think splitting up Ohio State, Michigan, and Legends and Leaders was a bad idea, because you're playing that game the last game of the regular season, and now maybe you're playing again in the Big Ten championship game. But if you would have had, it felt like when they went West and East, maybe the East was better on top, but the West was deeper top to bottom. And then it just turned out that there wasn't there wasn't really anybody who was consistently on the top, and it should have been Nebraska.
Mm-hmm.
And they took that into account when they did Legends and Leaders for 3 years, like historical, traditional, right? They split up the 4 best programs, which were Penn State, Nebraska, Ohio State, Michigan, did 2 and 2. And it's like, now you think about Nebraska being thought of that way. It's like, what? Why would anyone? That's where it was. So that's fine. We're doing a blame list. Let me look at, I got to check the schedule for the rest of the show. Do we have a blame list? I don't think I actually did a blame list, but I think Nebraska is first on that list.
Has to be. I mean, that's why they came to the Big Ten. It was, if you want to look at demographics between Nebraska and Missouri, for instance, who wanted to be in the Big Ten in the worst way, you got a state with less than 2 million people against a state with 2 metro areas and 6.5 million people. Basketball tradition, if you want to add that a little bit, Missouri is by far better than Nebraska, who still has not ever won an NCAA tournament game. It was because of football. It was because of Nebraska's tradition. I mean, 5 national championships, 3 in the 90s. It was still at a high level. And as you said, when they decided to go with competitive equality as the primary tenet rather than geography or anything else, they split the top 4, then they split the next 2, which was Wisconsin and Iowa. And then they kind of went down the list like, well, let's make sure Michigan State's with Michigan, and let's make sure this happens. And ultimately, that's a really good idea, except when you start to figure in, rivalry component. Now,
right.
Michigan and Ohio State, we've seen that since probably about the Harbaugh era. Yeah, you would have had some rematches, but before that, for about a 10-year period, you wouldn't have had any.
Right.
I mean, they weren't going to bowl games, and there was a fear that Michigan is going to flounder for a long time, but they were able to change it. Nebraska tried, with Scott Frost seemed like the perfect candidate for them. I mean, he had an undefeated season at UCF. He played there. He was the sun's coming home and the sun's going to shine. And of course, he was probably the biggest disappointment, I think, in Big Ten coaching history. With how he's performed. And then you look at the others, I think, again, Wisconsin, had taken steps back under Paul Chryst. Instead of being a, competitive team that was able to battle tooth and nail the way they did in the probably early part of the divisional debate, the last 4 to 5 years have been really mediocre. And then, Iowa has had some moments. They just couldn't add them up together. Like they had really good offenses a few times. 2017 against Ohio State, great tight ends. 6 guys who were drafted in the first 2 rounds. The last couple of years, really good defense and, the worst offense in Big Ten history. And so you have those dynamics, and that's what's made this such a difficult, era. And I think the other part is, you mentioned, the Big Ten West had a higher floor than the East because the worst records in the East in the whole Big Ten and crossovers came from Maryland and Rutgers coming in. Yeah. And you could always say that it's more difficult for an Iowa or Wisconsin to play Purdue or Minnesota than it was for anybody else to play Maryland or Rutgers.
Right.
And the early part of it. So it's almost like there were the layups were in the East, and then the Titans were in the East, and then everybody else was a little more bunched together.
If you think about like Scott Frost versus Jim Harbaugh as 2 prodigal sons returning home to revive their programs, flip the success. Mm-hmm. And you saw, I don't even know if it is a problem. It's like we're solving the problem of the Big Ten West after it's dead. I don't even know if it was a problem, but like that idea, how great Harbaugh turned out to be and how much of a disappointment Frost turned out to be when, of course, Harbaugh had a better resume coming in. But I thought they were probably in the same range of like big time hires. UCF, man, they had a fake national title. Like Scott Frost was a winner. Scott Frost was coming out of the Oregon idea of things. Like there was a lot to like about Scott Frost. He hadn't been to a Super Bowl. But that should have worked, and it didn't. So part of this, Scott, is the reality of what the Big Ten West was. And then another part of it, I think, is the perception of what the Big Ten West was. And I think people like me were probably part of the problem because when I looked at the crossover numbers, and I was doing a lot of math on notebook sheets of paper. I hope my numbers are right. I'm ready for you to tell me my numbers are wrong because I'm sure you have them memorized in your head. Do I have this right? 103 and 86 in crossover games. Did I hit it?
That is correct. That is correct. You are correct.
So,
yes.
But before I did the math, and listen, I was like scouring the Google machine. I was like, somebody else has done this math. Why am I doing it? And I couldn't exactly find it. So the East wins 103. The West wins 86 in crossover games. I thought it was going to be worse. I actually thought the East edge would be more. Don't you think a lot of people watching and listening to this, if you would have said, okay, they played almost 200 games against each other, how many did the East win? Would people say it's like, I don't know, 150 to 50? And it wasn't as bad maybe as the idea in our heads of the disparity between the two divisions.
Yeah, and there's multiple reasons for that. First of all, the last 2 years have been an abomination for the West. I mean, 8-13 both years. That matches the worst of all of them. The rest of the years were 7-7, 11-10, those types of numbers. So it goes back and forth. But the last 2 years, you saw a wide disparity between the East and West on the field. Another reason is the West Division, mainly because of Iowa and Wisconsin being probably the best teams in the West, they established the way to play and the way to win, which was ground acquisition football, line of scrimmage football, relying upon defense, not much offense. So it became boring football to most people. And then you look at the East and you look at the 5 stars, you look at the ability of Ohio State to recruit, and Michigan and Penn State, which are named programs anyway. And then the perception for most people is championships. Who wins championships? Who gets the playoff? Who does what? And that's where the East, whenever you're 10-0 in against the West. And so if Wisconsin would have broken through one of those years, like I think 17, they were undefeated. And if they would have broken through there, or if Iowa would have held off Michigan State in 15 and they were undefeated and go into the playoff, then that changes or alters the perception. But I think ultimately, when you look at the East, way higher recruiting ceiling, more wide open style of play, great athletes. Iowa has a tremendous amount of NFL guys, but they're tight ends, they're linemen, they're some D-backs, but they're in the 5th round range. And then so you throw on the excitement level, the winning the championship level, that really, and then the style of play, ground acquisition football, grind it out. Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota follows suit, Illinois follows suit. Nebraska tries to adapt with Frost, but then just couldn't get the fundamentals down. And at least that's where Iowa and Wisconsin were pretty good and still are, and it's fundamental football. That's why it was just such a tilted perception between the two divisions.
Mike, let's put up the graphic of the West records against the East in the 10-year history. Only 2 winning records: Iowa 17-10, Wisconsin 15-12, Minnesota 12-15, Nebraska 12-16, Northwestern 11-16, Illinois 10-17, and Purdue 9-17. You said something really interesting there, Scott, which is why I asked you to come on. Do you believe that the dissolution of divisions and the idea that there is no longer a style of play associated with half the league because the league's not divided, and that there maybe isn't a world where, well, if we play fundamental football and we're physical, we have a chance to win our division and get to Indy, and that's a victory in and of itself. You've taken that away. Will this force, maybe force is the wrong word, maybe it's just open opportunities for former West teams to go about their business a different way, open it up a little bit, maybe get a little more aggressive in recruiting. Could this be a good thing for these 7 teams to no longer be in the Big Ten West shell and following a Wisconsin-Iowa game plan, when now it's like, well, who cares? Now we got to beat Ohio State and Oregon and Penn State and USC. So Iowa-Wisconsin game plan, we got to compete with the high flyers. Could this be good for these teams?
Yes and no. I think it could be good for Iowa and Wisconsin and maybe Nebraska, but I don't think it's good for the others.
Okay.
Because the others, if you could play that style and you could play risk-averse football and you could win 13-10 and against a Wisconsin and Iowa, you have a chance. You have a pathway to a championship game like Purdue did with Charlie Jones and company a couple of years ago. But, for Iowa and Wisconsin, it changes the dynamic that you can't just decide, all right, I'm going to just hit body blows all day and get to Indianapolis, win 10 games, go on. Now, when you look at, say, Iowa's schedule this year, they play at Ohio State, which everybody, we all expect a loss. But, Washington comes to Iowa City. Even if Washington was good, coming to Iowa City is not an easy task for a lot of teams. Going to UCLA, I mean, that's probably the weakest of the 4 teams coming in program-wise. going to Michigan State. It's not what it was a couple of years ago with Kenneth Walker III. So they still have a pathway, even by playing these teams that, normally it's like, oh, none of the West teams are going to have a chance. Well, with the right schedule, you always have a chance. You're going to Maryland. You're not going to Penn State. So,
right.
So I do think that for a Wisconsin and Iowa, and Wisconsin's already in year 2 of this with Luke Fickell, they wanted to change how they do things. They went from about 30 to 35% 11 personnel under Paul Christ and their style of football with a lot of fullback to 90% 11 personnel. The last year, it didn't look good doing it. It looked like it was completely out of sorts. Iowa has now changed finally with an offensive coordinator. They're kind of molding a movement, motion-based offense to some extent with kind of the tenets and the fundamentals that they want to coach with. But, Kirk Ferentz has stepped out of the way, which I think is really smart. They're not necessarily going to go spread, but they're going to open things up, change a lot of the dynamic. That's really smart because, again, Iowa proved it. Wisconsin's proved it, even when it was a one conference, no divisions, that you can still win with line of scrimmage football. Michigan proved it. You can win with line of scrimmage football. And if you have a couple of skilled position players that execute at a high level, you can be very competitive, especially for a 12-team playoff. And, I look at some of those records, and some of them are a little bit skewed, Wisconsin 0-4 against Ohio State. It would look a lot better otherwise. Whereas, Nebraska was, 5-0 against Rutgers, and played Rutgers. I mean, so
half their East wins are against Rutgers. Yeah.
I mean, so they were losing a lot of other games, to a lot of other teams. So, I do think that this is healthier for the league because and then if Iowa gets to Indianapolis this year, let's say, or Wisconsin does, there's no, hey, but they're playing in the worst division of football. It's, hey, you got there legitimately.
No, I think there is opportunity in that it's everybody's on the level playing field and there are no buts. You're removing the buts. Now you're making life more difficult, but I think you're challenging all these schools to rise up. Now, one other point I do want to make, and Mike, we can bring up the disparity, like the 4 sort of bottom teams in the East versus the 3 best teams in the East. The West against Michigan State, Rutgers, Maryland, and Indiana was 71-37. That's like a 657 winning percentage. And then the West versus Michigan, Penn State, and Ohio State was 16-65. Yeah. That's a 188 winning percentage. But then even within that, the West won more than half its games against the East if you take out Ohio State. So was this just in the end? And listen, we started the show, Scott, before you jumped on. Almost every divisional breakdown in power conference football in this era had a stronger division and a weaker division. None with the disparity of 10-0, but everybody had the same. And guess what? It was usually like the West in the SEC was better. Why? Because Bama's in the West, right? In the Big 12, when they were still doing it based on divisions, it's like Texas and Oklahoma were in the same division. Nebraska was in the other division, and they weren't as good. There was a disparity, but Ohio State was 25-2 against the West. If you take out Ohio State being 25-2, all other games, the West is 84-78 against the East. That's including Penn State and Michigan. So in the end, when you have one single team that is going to dominate this era the way Ohio State did, and clearly Michigan's dominated the last 3 years, but over the 10-year period, it's Ohio State. Was this going to happen no matter what? And whatever division Ohio State was in was going to be perceived as the better division, perhaps unfairly so, and to a larger extent than it really was.
No question, especially up and through 2021, when you looked at that 7-year period. And I know I talked about it a lot then. I'm like, really, you could have Ohio State and any other team you want. You could flip Wisconsin and Iowa with Michigan, Penn State. You can say, hey, you get Indiana, Purdue, Maryland, Rutgers, Illinois, Nebraska, whatever, on one side, everybody else on the other. And it's still going to look the same because of Ohio State just towered above everybody. I think in the last 3 years, what's made it even more pronounced between the West and the East is Michigan got up to that level. Ohio State remained at that level. And then the West started teetering a little bit, and there was just no breakthrough against those three teams. I mean, the only team in the West to beat every team in the East over that 10-year period was Iowa. Iowa was the only one to do it. In fact, they were the only one to win more than the beat. Only I think Wisconsin beat 5 out of the 7 teams. I think the only Penn State and Ohio State didn't beat. So it was, it was a grind. But Ohio State is and still remains to me still the flagship program in the Big Ten, despite Michigan's recent run because of the history here. I mean, you look at just what they've done, in the East and West as their overall record, 115-15. They have 100 more wins over a 10-year period than everybody else. Next is Michigan at 94 and 32. I mean, that's still, 21 more wins than the next team. And, and there's some really good teams, but Ohio State tips is just so high. No matter who was in the East with them, it was always going to end up this way.
So let's go back to big picture. How will you remember the Big Ten West? How should the Big Ten West be remembered? I will tell you, I've been working on a Candle in the Wind parody song of the Big Ten West called Conference with the West. I may sing it at the end of the show. I may not, but I want to have sort of those, I don't know if warm and fuzzy memories, but I think they probably should be warm and fuzzier than sort of what we said before, then first blush of like, oh, West sucks. Yeah. And it's like, well, yes, the East was better, but actually, when you think about a lot of the things that we've covered, it's not as egregious as maybe your impression was. When someone comes up to you in 20 years, Mr. Dochterman, you're my favorite sports writer ever. What was the Big Ten West like? What will your answer be?
It was a grinded out West Division. It was boring, physical, but it was also fun. I mean, there was no more perfect division for Iowa than the West Division. Every school but Purdue was on its border, and Purdue was just barely over the Illinois border. So they have a history with one another. These games mattered to each other more so than they mattered beyond each other. I mean, the pig, the axe, the bull, the whatever, the stove hat that they replaced the sweet sweet tomahawk with Indiana and Illinois and Northwestern. And then you look at the cannon. I mean, there are a lot of trophy games and a lot of, close, hard fought physical games that mattered among themselves. People outside of the West Division don't care, and that's fine. But for the people who live there and buy tickets and buy jerseys or T-shirts, for people in Iowa to beat Wisconsin's a big deal, even though they may be deciding who's going to the Music City Bowl versus who's going to the Alabama Bowl. But those games matter, and that's the essence of college football, because there are the Ohio States and the Michigans that go and win national titles, but 130 other teams don't. And a lot of these teams never will. Maybe they, I think there's some in the West that have a chance to get to the playoff, maybe win a playoff game, maybe host one, maybe win 2. But I don't see any of them being able to last 4 rounds against some teams that recruit 5 stars, and then their 5-star wide receiver gets hurt, and then they throw in another freshman 5-star. I mean, Ohio State, Marvin Harrison leaves. Well, Jeremiah Smith's going to come in, and he's going to be the next great wide receiver. Nothing like that. So for them, this is fun. This is how they remember it. And so there is a little bit of a bummer that some of these rivalries won't get played with regularity, that going from Iowa to play Northwestern in the Chicagoland area where they recruit heavily, that's only going to be every 2 to 5, twice every 5 years instead of going to Maryland and Rutgers or Washington and UCLA. But overall, it was a disappointment, because I thought they could have, should have, would have broken through a couple of times in Indianapolis, maybe put themselves on the map a little bit better.
You're a chronicler of everything college football, but you are in Iowa. You have covered the Iowa football program for a long time. When you think specifically, and you've mentioned the Hawkeyes a lot, what will you remember most from the Iowa perspective about the Big Ten West? Is it the opportunity that was right there at the goal line against Michigan State in what was a playoff game play-in, when it was a 4-5 game in the Big Ten championship game in 15? Is that the moment, or is there something else about this 10-year period of the Hawkeyes that will stand out the most?
I think like a lot of things in the Iowa tenure, probably under Kirk Ferentz, is close, but no cigar. I mean, they were close in a lot of different years, a lot of different ways, and it just couldn't get over the top. I mean, I think 15, the chemistry of that team, the grit, the toughness, it was unfairly tarnished in my eyes, that they have nothing. They still have like 10 players from that team in the NFL. George Kittle and some really good Josie Jewell, some really good players that were on that team. And to be that close and to see that grind of a, drive and how hotly contested it was, it's still one of the greatest games I've ever seen. But I think if there's a couple of seasons that, like the last two championship games against Michigan, they were overmatched. They were not as good as Michigan. No question there. I do think in 20, the COVID year, they were very, very good. And by the end of the year, which they had beaten teams by an average of 21 points over the last 6 games, that would have been a team that I think Ohio State would have feared in Indianapolis. It would have been a very competitive game. I mean, but I think the biggest blunder of them all in the Big Ten West era was 18, when they had Fant and Hawkinson, and they averaged 32 points a game. And I just remember a game in Penn State. They're down 4 points, 3 minutes to go. And the receiver and Noah Fant, the tight end, are looking at each other like this. They snap the ball. They throw in a goal line interception. They lose by 4 points. And that was a team that I thought had the juice to if not get to Indy, and not only get to Indy, but compete in Indy. And instead, close, good. We have very good records, among the 10 best in the country over this 10-year period, but just not breaking through. And, it's by their own doing. I mean, their offense the last few years, part of it's bad luck, part of it's injuries, part of it's lack of recruiting or players leaving or whatever. But part of it is their own doing. Their schematics were down. Their choices were down. So I just think they were close, a B+ program. They did a lot with the talent that they didn't have, and built a lot of talent that really and took off. But just, that they needed a breakthrough and they didn't get one.
Last thing, and we've asked some other Big Ten West writers about this. We've touched on it. Is this better or worse for Iowa, for the Iowa football program, a new world with no divisions? I will say initially when the rivalry games came out that the Big Ten announced, I was like, man, why are there so many? Why does Iowa get so many rivalry games? And I've completely switched my thinking on that I think one of the biggest challenges, I'm excited for the 12-team playoff world. I think there's a lot of potential with the realignment of the sport. There's going to be a bunch of exciting games, but I think one of the most difficult things is going to be defining success, especially for those teams who are very good, but not quite at the level where they're thinking national title every year. Iowa's a great example of this. So how do you define success when getting to Indy is no longer a goal? Well, one of the best ways to do it is to beat your rival. We beat them. We hate them and we beat them. We're like them and we define ourselves by them. But if you don't play as much, it's rough. So I actually love now the idea that Iowa kept more rivalry games than anybody. They still have the Cy-Hawk Trophy game. I think Iowa's going to be able to define themselves better than some other teams who are just kind of going to be floating out there going like, I don't know, is 9-3 good or not? I don't know. Better or worse for Iowa in this coming world compared to what it has been?
I think it's better, because I think this is a chance to kind of break out from this closet type of an environment and make yourself a better program, make yourself more attractable, facing different teams. I understand, playing Purdue, playing Illinois, playing Northwestern, those are important games, but I think you want to get more exposure, and with more exposure and more victories brings more abilities to recruit. And they needed to do that. And they kind of recruited to how they could win and how they could compete. But I agree with you about the trophy games. And, Iowa had 3 that were in the Big Ten that mattered for different reasons. And then you throw Iowa State in there, because who can you say is Iowa's biggest rival? You can't. I can't define that. It kind of depends on which part of the state you live in. If you're in central Iowa where your coworkers are Iowa State fans, it's always the Cy-Hawk. If you're in eastern Iowa, it's an important game, but so is this. I mean, you play for the Pig. That's a great trophy game. You play for, Wisconsin's only 2.5 hours away, and that's a physical game you see all year in the Big Ten. And then Nebraska, Iowa has a lot of equity being on Black Friday, and 2 fan bases that are rabid and, just don't like each other at all.
Yeah.
I mean, more so than the other fan bases. So how do you define success if you're 8-4 and instead of playing Nebraska and Wisconsin, you're playing Maryland and Indiana? That's so. I mean, for an Ohio State, how do you define success? Well, in this year, it's winning it all. And if you don't win it all this year, it's a disappointment to the nth degree. This year for Iowa, how do you define success other than beating your rivals? It's getting to the playoff and winning a playoff game. And that's probably the ceiling for Iowa most years. Next year, when all these players, these defensive players exit, it's going to be, hey, did we hang on to our trophies? We're 7-5. We went to a bowl game. It's a rebuilding year. And that's what most programs, all but 20 programs really are going to define their season is, did I get to a bowl game? Did I get to hold on to my trophies? And I think for Iowa, 2 or 3 every 5 years period, putting themselves in playoff contention is right there. But the other years, it's going to be about, making sure that they ran across the field and kept their trophy against these teams.
You're very good on like scheduling and like structure of the sport. You're always talking to people about that. I'm going to squeeze one more question in here before I let you go. Could we get back to some kind of division within the Big Ten down the road? Like, I don't even know if it's divisions, but like are we now going to be in a world where it's like, all right, they've got 18 now, maybe they'll get to 20, maybe they'll get to 22, and they're just a big blob of teams, and you take the 2 best and send them to a title game? Or do you think we could eventually break it down again into smaller groups? Because it's like, as soon as college sports decides what it is, it looks at its watch and it's like, oh, we've been this way for 15 minutes. Let's change what we are. Could it change?
I don't know. I don't think so. I think right now they are so committed to this divisionless structure that everybody, and Penn State was at the forefront. Penn State really did not want to be in the East. Of course, they hated, getting the second place in the beauty contest in a lot of years, and they wanted to play everybody. They consider themselves unrivaled, and now they are. So they were forceful with it. Everybody else was like, well, I guess I could see it. The only disadvantage of it, frankly, is that you at the West, at least you had another race that even if it's an 8-3 Iowa and an 8-3 Purdue, they're going into that last game, and whoever wins gets to be the champion. Then you had eyes on a game that maybe nobody else would see. But now you got the playoff component, and now you could be a 9-2 Iowa playing Nebraska or a 9-2 Wisconsin playing Minnesota into that last weekend, and everybody's going to be watching it. And getting to Indianapolis is kind of irrelevant. It's actually about getting to the playoff. And so I don't see them going to something like that unless they shed teams. It's just too complicated, I think. And how do you divide it? I don't know, man.
9-2 Nebraska, 9-2 Iowa going into Black Friday is on the table this year. I think it is, given the schedules of those 2 teams. You agree?
I agree with the scheduling part of it. But with Nebraska, I'm just struggling, as always, to just say, every year I say this, and then every year it's like a kick me sign. It's like, come on, man, you haven't even been to a bowl since 2016. Let's do something here. But
freshman quarterback, they got a freshman quarterback. They'll be fine. Freshman quarterbacks always work out. It'll be great.
Yeah, they work out against good defenses usually. But but no, the problem is that's probably the biggest downside of the Big Ten West. If we want to wrap this conversation up with this, could you have told me 10 years ago that Black Friday game would not have been at least once a winner-take-all game for the Big Ten West? I would have bet on it at least twice, maybe 3 times, and it turned out to be 0 times. Iowa, out of their 3 division titles, 2 of them which were clinched before they went and played that game, and then the other one they won and kind of worked their way in. So very disappointing, I thought.
And how good will it be, right? The idea that Iowa, Nebraska on Black Friday is a banger with stakes. We don't know what that is. Like if and when, whatever the structure is, if and when we get to that point, it's going to be awesome. Scott Dochterman, for the people who don't know, who doesn't know Scott Dochterman, where can they find your work? Where can they follow you? Just make sure. How can people keep up with you?
I'm on Twitter at Scott Dochterman, so that's pretty easy there with my name. But then also I'm at The Athletic. I'm now a national reporter, but with Big Ten emphasis, and still live in Iowa, so I'll still be doing all things Big Ten West. So I'm excited about that in name only, if nothing else.
In name only, in name only, in our hearts,
Yes.
and maybe not in our minds anymore. So I'll let you know if I finish the song. I'll send you the song if
Okay.
I finish it. I really want to finish it just for myself. I've been walking around singing the lyrics to it all week. I don't know if I can actually do it. Anyway, he's Scott Dochterman, does great work. Follow him for everything college football at The Athletic. Scott, so much. Thanks so much for joining us here on Kings of the North.
Thanks, Doug. I appreciate it.
All right, Zach Heilprin. No Big Ten West. Good for Wisconsin and Wisconsin fans, or bad for Wisconsin and Wisconsin fans?
I mean, I think it's good for Wisconsin fans because they're going to get a chance to see some of these other teams that are, the brands of college football that everybody wants. But I mean, no, I think it's bad for Wisconsin. I don't know that's horrible, but it's not great, right? Like, you get to play throughout this since 2014. You got to play Illinois, you got to play Purdue, you got to play Minnesota, you got to play Iowa, you got to play Nebraska, you got to play Northwestern. Like, you get to play those teams every single year. That's 6 of your games every single year. You have a very good chance of ending up in the Big Ten championship game. And Wisconsin did that as much as anybody. I think Iowa may have ended up tying them late in this in the Big Ten West history. But I don't think it's good for Wisconsin that all of a sudden some of those other teams that you're going to be replacing an Illinois with a Penn State, or replacing a Purdue with an Ohio State. I don't know that's great for Wisconsin's chances of winning the Big Ten. It was you always went into the season thinking they had a chance to get to the Big Ten title game and then it's just like, you just got to hit, have a great game and hope the Buckeyes didn't. And unfortunately for Wisconsin, that never happened, but they always had a chance to get there and win it and win the West. So yeah, it's not good for the Badgers. I think it gets a whole heck of a lot more difficult to win the Big Ten without the Big Ten West.
Favorite when it comes to the Big Ten West might not be the right adjective to use here, but what pops to mind when you think of this Big Ten West era, especially as it relates to the Badgers?
Yeah, and I probably am not alone in this, but punt. Like, just the word punt and all the punts that happened. I'm thinking about some of the games against Iowa. There was a 10-6 game in 2015 where it was a bunch of turnovers and a lot of punts. It was, in 2017, Wisconsin held them to minus 20 some odd yards rushing, whole bunch of punts. The only time that Iowa even scored was on 2 pick sixes by Josh Jackson. It's just, I would say, just really bad offensive football, probably, or really great defensive football, depending on whether you're a glass half full or glass half empty type of guy. But punt is going to be the one that goes down with the Big Ten West. I think that is the word that probably is associated with that group more than any other.
Matt Shelton of Wildcat Report. Northwestern, no Big Ten West. Good for the Wildcats and good for their fans, or bad for the Wildcats and bad for their fans?
Unfortunately, it's pretty bad. Northwestern's really enjoyed kind of the highlight of 21st century, or I should say the last decade or so, has been heading to the Big Ten championship in 2018 and 2020 to take on Ohio State. Both times, really exciting games. Great to see the Wildcats kind of hang tough for a half or three quarters, but now that divisions are gone, the Indianapolis days are pretty unequivocally over. The odds you see a Northwestern team play for a Big Ten championship in the foreseeable future, it's really hard. It's really hard to see the team cracking the top shell of 3-4 teams where it's like you have to be better than at least two of Ohio State, Michigan, and Oregon, not to mention USC, Penn State, Washington. The list goes on. There's a real top tier of the conference that has really solidified now that divisions are out, and that's kind of the clock has struck midnight on Northwestern's ability to make any kind of Cinderella run to those types of games.
All right, so when I say Big Ten West and Northwestern again, I mean, 2 Big Ten West titles is nothing to sneeze at. What jumps to mind? What is your favorite Big Ten West, or the even? I'm very cautious with the word favorite when it comes to the Big Ten West. What is the memorable thing that you'll remember from this era of that division?
Yeah, this might be a little petty, and it might also maybe not be the headliner for most other Northwestern fans, but I want to say in the 2018 season, Nebraska opened winless, opened 0-5, and they had never gone 0-6 before. And they came to Northwestern and they got up, I want to say, either by 10 or 14 in the fourth quarter. And fans had actually brought a sign that said, like, the streak is broken and unfurled it in the stands. Then Northwestern came back and won in overtime. And I think there are a bunch of many different rivalries that Northwestern has. Obviously, Illinois is number one, and then probably Iowa, Wisconsin in that second tier. But I definitely think Northwestern really enjoyed twisting the knife on Nebraska about their newfound place in college football and being stuck in the Big Ten West with us and kind of dragging them down to our level and beating them with experience. And I think that game was kind of the perfect encapsulation, at least for me as a fan at the time. I really loved that game.
I love petty. Petty is great.
Yeah.
All right. We'll add it to the list of words to describe the Big Ten West. Petty. But also, man, don't bring a banner. Don't unfurl your "we broke the streak"
so
banner in the
fun.
middle of a game.
I gotta find the picture to send it to you. It was hysterical.
Wow. No, can't be doing that. All right. Thank you. Ryan Burns, good or bad for Minnesota fans and the Minnesota football program that there's no more Big Ten West?
Oh, it's a great question. I would say it's probably more bad than good, just because for a school like Minnesota, you're not going to have, especially in this day and age of college football, the money backing that some of the Ohio States and Oregons and some of these programs with significant NIL backing have, to where the hope would be for a school like Minnesota. I mean, like they were in the Big Ten West, you can be able to compete every single year for a shot at Indianapolis. Now that path gets a lot more difficult because you're going to have to compete with everybody in the division and not just Wisconsin and Iowa. So I think long-term, I'm going to be very curious to see, or even as maybe as short as 2025, does the Big Ten elect to bring back divisions in some sort? I mean, we've spent a lot of time talking about this in some other podcasts, that I think it would be beneficial to potentially have four pods of, 4 or 5, depending upon if the Big Ten expands again here. Then you can have your division winner get into a Big Ten semifinal. But until that happens, you're a school like Minnesota and you're looking up at the Penn States and the Michigans and the Ohio States of the world, and it's going to be incredibly difficult to get to Indianapolis now. So I think it certainly doesn't help a school like Minnesota, but I'm just going to, I'm wishing and pining for those days of the Big Ten West where that you didn't have to compete against the Big Three. Now that obviously the world is changing with all those West Coast schools coming in, it's a different day and age.
And when I say Big Ten West to you, what leaps to mind? Is there a Minnesota moment? Is there a vibe? What did the Big Ten West mean in the Twin Cities?
I think what I'm going to always remember, I'll say two things. I'll remember that 2019 season where Minnesota somehow finds a way to start. They have an incredible season. I mean, they ended up winning 11 games, end up winning the Outback Bowl over Auburn, and they still found a way not to get to Indianapolis. Just so many times where PJ Fleck and Minnesota were in a great position in November to finally get that berth, and then just could never get over that hump. So many opportunities, so many missed opportunities. And so that's what I'm going to miss there. But I think nationally, as someone who covers a team in the Big Ten West, I think watching national reporters just talk about Iowa's offense or Torrey Taylor, I think that's what's going to be synonymous, I think, with people who don't live and breathe this every day, is just inept offenses, inept quarterback play, strong defenses certainly, but I think the ability for the Big Ten West to somehow always find a way to never score points or never get consistent quarterback play is something I'm going to remember about the West. I mean, it's not going to be heartbroken on me that I don't have to go to Ryan Field. No, I guess it's no longer here now, but I remember even going to a game there last year. It's a night game in September, beautiful day, beautiful night. There's probably 4,500 people in the seats. I mean, some of that, I'm going to enjoy going to LA or Oregon or Washington or just some places I always haven't been. I've been to Champaign, Illinois enough. I've been to West Lafayette enough. I'm going to enjoy potentially seeing some different teams that I don't get to see on a given basis, but I'm not going to miss some of these offenses that the Big Ten West is always going to be synonymous with.
All right. So thanks to Zach and Ryan and Matthew for doing that for us, to give us that perspective on Wisconsin and Minnesota and Northwestern. We obviously got the Iowa perspective from Scott. So the other three teams in the West, I didn't want to bother everybody on vacation. It's July. It's like late June. It's early July. Like, we don't want to be doing this to people. So Illinois, Purdue, and Nebraska, I do want to answer those questions, though. These other three former West teams, is the new world better or worse for them? So Illinois, it's worse. I think Illinois, Scott and I talked about that, like, Nebraska is the most disappointing team of the Big Ten West era. I think Illinois is right there, though, because there have been times in Illinois history where Illinois is like pretty competitive and interesting. And I think Illinois probably should be that. And the fact that Illinois was 10-17 in crossover games in Big Ten West history, the fact that Illinois was 2-10 against Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State, just like never competitive. And now what? I actually think that there was like a little window there for Illinois with getting Brett Bielema in there of like, okay, can Bielema Bielema was a successful Big Ten West coach at Wisconsin. Can he supercharge? Now, actually, he never coached in the Big Ten West, I guess, but he was like a good legend or leader guy, right? He succeeded at Wisconsin. And it didn't happen. And now the West is gone. And I think, there was a time like Lovie Smith. They were four different Illinois coaches in the history of the Big Ten West: Brett Bielema, Lovie Smith, Bill Cubit, and Tim Beckman. They were in no man's land for a while there. And I think if you had gone in with where Big Ten West teams were going into 2014, and you said this division's going to last 10 years, how many titles should everybody get? I think you might have said that Illinois should get one, and Illinois didn't get one. It was 4 Wisconsin, 3 Iowa, 2 Northwestern, and 1 Purdue. Nebraska probably should have gotten one too, right? But like I don't want to let Illinois off the hook here. So now, Illinois is going to play its rivalry game with Northwestern, but how is Illinois otherwise going to be defined? Like, they have a chance to get lost. So I think this new world could be very tough for Illinois. They might have to get really aggressive in NIL. They might have. Now, with everybody, it's a chance to elevate. You're going to be forced to try harder or at least try different. So if you don't want to get lost, you got to step up your game. I don't love the spot Illinois is in. Purdue, I do think has a chance. Like, you have such a defining rivalry with Indiana, which you had as a crossover rivalry in the old world. That did protect Purdue because it was the only rivalry that was an every year game between East and West teams. Purdue played everybody else in the East fewer times. So, for instance, Purdue was 1-7 against Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State. Minnesota was 1-11. So they played like 4 fewer games over a decade against Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State than everybody else. But like, they still have the worst record. They were still 9-17 in crossover games, even though we're playing Indiana every year. So I think Purdue has more of a chance to define itself potentially. Purdue was sort of always on the border of like, is Purdue and Indiana West teams or East teams? I don't know. I think Purdue has a chance to maybe pick up some juice here. I don't know, like, is there really that much of a difference between Purdue and Illinois? So probably overall, here's what I would say. Like, overall, this is worse for Purdue, but like, it hasn't been good for Purdue, but then it got good at the end and it did win one in the West. Jeff Brom had it going at the end, but there's almost a part of me like that Jeff Brom version of Purdue where they're throwing it around a little bit with Aiden O'Connell and, David Bell as a receiver and just like some skill guys. I maybe would have wanted to see that out in the world a little bit more. Now, that's not necessarily what Ryan Walters is going to do, but he's being aggressive in the portal. They're getting some Georgia guys in here. I think Purdue might get after it a little bit. So I think this is worse for Purdue. No division is worse for a team that was 9-17 against the East. Now you're going to play the East more. It is worse, but there's maybe a little potential there. So then that leaves Nebraska. Is this better or worse for Nebraska? Nebraska was 12-16 against the East, was 2-10 against Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State. Nebraska shouldn't be hiding. This is better for Nebraska. So I do think in the end, the right answer is no divisions is better for Iowa and Nebraska, and it's worse for everybody else because Wisconsin was able to dominate in its own way. There's potential there, But I do think, like, will Wisconsin ever get back to that level of sort of like regular top 10 team in a world where there's no divisions and where Oregon and USC and Washington are here? That could be tough. But Nebraska can't hide. Nebraska shouldn't be hiding. Nebraska is a national power like in many of our lifetimes. It's not that ancient history. So I don't think Matt Rule wants to hide behind a division. And so let's let Nebraska spread its wings and then fail on an even larger scale. Listen, I don't think they're going to fail. I do think they're going to have a good year this year. But I want to see Nebraska playing Penn State and Oregon and USC and Michigan, right? I want to see more of that. That's good for college football. And I think Nebraska can get more competitive in a way that makes those games interesting. So let's go. Let's go, Cornhuskers. It's a challenge. Rise to the challenge. No more hiding. But you hid before and you were bad. That's Scott's stat. They have like the longest ball drive of any team in the country. It's Nebraska. That's wild. But it's going to be tougher. Rise to the challenge. All right. Here's the thing I'm a little bit worried about with the committee. The question is the committee going to penalize conference title game losers and allow them then in the final playoff rankings to get into the 12-team playoff? Will they drop any of those losers behind idle teams that last week? That you have earned the right to go lose your conference title game by being one of the two best teams. There's no back door. There's no side door. There's no, we were the best team in a bad division, but maybe we're actually the third or fourth or fifth best team in this conference. And so now you can penalize us if we lose because maybe we were frauds, right? We should have never been there. There's none of that. This is clearly going to be the two best teams. Now, schedules will matter. If Iowa gets in to the Big Ten title game, does that definitively mean that Iowa is the second best team in the Big Ten? Maybe not, in a world where, Michigan's playing, where Michigan, Oregon, and Ohio State are all playing each other, right? I don't know, but it's not going to be as bad as it was. So I am a little worried about a situation where a conference title game for any of the four major conferences is like number 3 versus number 9 in the playoff rankings. Number 3 beats number 9 pretty handily. And now number 9 doesn't make the playoff because when the final rankings come out, number 9 has fallen to number 13 and only the top 11 teams in the rankings are going to get in, right? And then you're going to have one spot for the group of 5. And like, you understand there's 4 conference champs. There could be a conference champ who's not in, whatever. Could you fall out of the playoff? Like almost the thing I'm thinking about is like, if you declined your spot in a conference title game, would that actually be more advantageous to you? Where if we had declined our spot, stayed home, rested on our 10-2 record, and not risked a loss, would we have made the playoff? But going and playing an excellent team, the number 1 team in our conference, kicked us out of the playoff. I don't want that. Now, I guess I also don't think that every conference title game should be between 2 teams who are guaranteed playoff spots, but I really don't like that first idea. So I tried to look at the history of the power conference title games in the playoff era. Okay. This is a little wonky and it's a little different because again, you had divisions, so it wasn't guaranteed to be the 2 best teams. But in this era, there were only 2 unranked teams. As much as I just outlined how there was a dominant division and a weaker division in every conference, there were only 2 situations in the last 10 years, which included 47 conference title games because for 3 of those years, the Big 12 didn't have a conference title game. So there's 47 examples. Only 2 of those teams were not ranked in the playoff rankings at all going into conference championship weekend. It was 2018 Pitt in the ACC and 2022 Purdue in the Big Ten. So they're at least a top 25 team all these times. Okay. 26 of those 47 teams were ranked in the top 11. And the top 11, again, is my dividing line. That's basically a playoff spot for you. So how many of those 26 teams that were in the top 11 going in lost and then fell out of the top 11. This is what I'm on alert for. And actually, it's only 3. 2014 Georgia Tech was 11th. They lost to an excellent Florida State team that made the playoff, the 4-team playoff. They lost 37-35, and they fell to 12th. 2017 TCU was 11th. Got blown out by an Oklahoma team that made the playoff, Baker Mayfield. Fell from 11th to 15th. 2021 Oregon was 10th. Lost to Utah 38-10. Fell from 10th to 14th. And then the other one that I was on alert for a little bit, 2019 Utah was 5th going into conference championship weekend, lost 37-15 to Oregon and fell to 11th. So that was a 6-spot drop. I didn't like a 6-spot drop. That seemed like a lot to me, but the committee did a better job than I anticipated going in of looking at a conference title game loser and not penalizing them. So I'm less worried about this than I was going in, but they have to keep this thinking. And it's also one thing to do it. It's like, hey, we had a team 10th, they lost, we kept them 10th. In a world where it kind of didn't matter that much, now it's really going to matter. I hope their thinking doesn't change. I don't think you should miss out on a playoff spot because you lost your conference championship game. Now, if it's tooth and nail and it's like, okay, you're right on the edge of making it, but it's a coin flip between you and somebody else, and you've earned the right to have the committee get one more look at you, and this other team stayed home, and then you go out and completely lay an egg, and it's like, okay, we had worries about you, and you confirmed our fears. Okay, I'm not saying you shouldn't lose your playoff spot based on that, but like in general, I think this is a decent guideline. But if you look through this, I'm looking at teams, their ranking going into conference championship weekend and their ranking after losing. 16th, they stayed 16th. 11th, they dropped to 12th. 10th, they stayed 10th. 13th, they fell to 17th. 10th, they fell to 14th. 13th, they fell to 15th. Anyway, I'm just like grabbing random ones. It's not bad. Most of these teams, if you're like in like the 8 to 12 range, you either kept your spot or went down like 1 or 2 spots with a loss. So it's just where I think almost everything about the 12-team playoff is going to be better. I think people grew frustrated by the dominant division, weaker division thing, and they believe that it's a solution to have no divisions and the 2 best teams play each other. And in some ways, it is a solution, but it also can create another new problem if you're not careful. Does that make sense? Am I explaining myself here? That's my fear. That's my fear. Okay. So that's all. I just don't think, for instance, in the Big Ten, if there's like a tight race, let's say between Penn State, Oregon, Iowa, and Michigan to be the number 2 team in the Big Ten, and you're getting into tiebreakers and all these things, and somebody gets in and Penn State gets in and loses to Ohio State for a second time, let's say, and now all of a sudden the 4 playoff teams for the Big Ten are Ohio State, Oregon, Iowa, and Michigan, because Penn State won the tiebreaker and earned the chance to go lose to Ohio State a second time. I don't think that's right. That's what I'm worried about. Are you worried about that? Maybe worried's the wrong word. I'm curious about it. So there's going to be a lot of potentially complicated discussions, splicing teams 10 and 11 from teams 12, 13, and 14. And there's part of it that it's like, hey, man, if you want to make the playoff, like, don't be team 10, be team 5. It's kind of on you. You had your opportunities. If you're talking about your second loss or your third loss, it's like, hey, man, you had a shot. So, I'm not going to be crying tears for these teams, but I want you earning a chance at a new game, an extra game, to not be a penalty. Okay, that was a lot of like me worrying about things before they happen. You guys have seen Inside Out too, right? Anxiety. I'm planning for things. I have anxiety about possible conference title game losers, but we want to wrap up the Big Ten West with the final farewell. I have my superlatives. I have the best player in the 10 years of the Big Ten West, the best quarterback, the best coach, the best individual win, and the best team. And then I might try to sing my song. We'll do that when we wrap this up on Kings of the North. Back on Kings of the North, this will be our only show this week. We'll take off the second show for America's birthday. Happy birthday, America. Wrapping up the Big Ten West. best player in the history of the Big Ten West. So I looked at this 10 years, 2014 to 2023. Top 10 Heisman Trophy finishers, Big Ten East versus Big Ten West. The Big Ten East had 19 top 10 Heisman finishers in that 10-year period. 10 from Ohio State, 5 from Michigan, 2 from Michigan State, and 1 each from Indiana and Penn State. The Big Ten West had 4. They were all Wisconsin running backs, and 3 of the 4 were the same guy. And that's why he is my best player in the history of the Big Ten West, and it's Jonathan Taylor, the running back from Wisconsin. Melvin Gordon finished second in the Heisman race in 2014, Wisconsin running back. Jonathan Taylor, 2017, finished 6th. 2018 finished 9th. 2019 finished 5th. Almost ran for 2,000 yards the one year. I think is the second leading rusher in Big Ten history. Was a propulsive force for Wisconsin's success. Now, I think if you were going to think of a position in the Big Ten West, it might be an Iowa tight end or an Iowa defender, but I think the number one position in the history of the Big Ten West is Wisconsin running back. And, Ron Dayne never played in the Big Ten West, but Wisconsin's been running great running backs through there forever. And so Taylor, in a lot of ways, is the peak of that because he did it over 3 years. I mean, 3 times as a top 10 Heisman finisher is no joke, man. So, 2019, there was a lot of, I think, interesting discussion about who the best running back in the Big Ten was between J.K. Dobbins at Ohio State and Jonathan Taylor at Wisconsin. They play each other in the Big Ten title game. Like, they had some good matchups, but he's just a defining player, and he's gone on to be a very good player in the NFL. And so I don't know that there's much argument here. And I do think I almost made it a lineman. I was like, is it Brandon Scherf from Iowa? Maybe it's that. There's some great. Antoine Winfield Jr. is a tremendous defensive back from Minnesota that you could work in there. It definitely could be a defensive player because they're really, I think one of the defining things that's always been difficult for me in the Big Ten West is because you would go through and then like national ratings, like computer ratings of defenses, you could look and at times it'd be like, 6 of the best 10 defenses in the country in the Big Ten West, or 4 of the top 9. And it's like, are they? Or is it that the offenses are so bad, the defenses put up good stats? And so a computer, which doesn't have eyes, you ever notice that a computer doesn't have eyes? They have a camera though, but no eyes. They can't watch the game. They just look at numbers. And it's like, oh my gosh, this Big Ten West defense only gave up 133 yards last week. And it's like, did you see the quarterback that defense played? Because the Big Ten West did not have many quarterbacks. We'll get to that in a second. So maybe I should have picked a defender, but I actually think running the ball, like with what Scott talked about, just like physical running the ball, I think it's Jonathan Taylor. So if you want to disagree with this, feel free at Doug Lesmerises on Twitter, send me a message, put a comment underneath here on YouTube. Like, maybe you can make an argument. I'm not sure it's a super strong one. 23 All-Americans in the history of the Big Ten West. 10 at Iowa in a 10-year period, which again is pretty good. I think one of the things we're remembering here is like Iowa actually had some very talented people. And as Scott said very well, got in its own way, could never get over the top. Iowa's a pretty good football program. 10 All-Americans at Iowa, 6 at Wisconsin. Jonathan Taylor, I think, is 2 of them. Purdue had 2, Northwestern had 2, Illinois had 2, Minnesota had 1, Antoine Winfield Jr., as we mentioned. Nebraska had none. No All-Americans in a 10-year period. First-team All-Americans, we're talking about. No first-team All-Americans. So 23 for the Big Ten West. So we'll make Jonathan Taylor the best player in the history of the Big Ten West. Next up is best quarterback, and I was tempted to pass on this category. No pun intended. In the history of this divisional setup, Big Ten East, Big Ten West, the 10 years. So the all Big Ten teams, they do like a first, second, and third team every year, coaches and media. So 30 quarterbacks made all Big Ten in some way in this 10-year period. 23 from the East, 7 from the West. And I'm not sure it should have been 7. Here are your 7 Big Ten West quarterbacks that ever made all Big Ten. 2015, C.J. Beathard, Iowa, second team. Get ready for this. This is going to blow your mind. This is like the end of the Schwab, like last question. Name the 7 Big Ten West quarterbacks who made all Big Ten. I can't believe this list. 2017, Clayton Thorson from Northwestern was third team. 2018, David Blau from Purdue was third team. 2019, Tanner Morgan from Minnesota was second team. 2020, Peyton Ramsey from Northwestern was third team, and he was an Indiana transfer, so he started in the East. And then 2021 and 2022, the last 2 spots are the same guy. It's Aiden O'Connell from Purdue, who was second team both of those years to CJ Stroud. And that's why Aiden O'Connell is the best quarterback in the history of the Big Ten West. I don't think it's close. Jeff Brom and that offense get a lot of credit here, but Aiden O'Connell went on and started games in the NFL for the Raiders last year as a rookie. He is a real dude. So former walk-on, great story. But when I'm going through this list and writing stuff down, it's is it CJ Beathard? Is it CJ Beathard? Is this CJ Beathard? Because Russell Wilson was pre-West, right? Russell Wilson is 2011. Is it CJ Beathard? I said that 14 times. But it's Aiden O'Connell. But it is also telling you something here of this is the situation that the West dealt with. And so I think in the end, 2 things really help define the West, which is great defenses and lack of passing attacks for the most part. And so if these 7 former West teams are going to elevate and rise to this new challenge, they got to throw the ball, brother. So Dylan Raiola at Nebraska is super exciting. And Wisconsin is trying to throw the ball. They have Tyler Van Dyke as a transfer from Miami. It's okay. Minnesota didn't sit on its hands. Max Brosmer as a guy coming from New Hampshire, maybe he can do something. We like some of the talent at Illinois. Are you looking at Hudson Card making another leap at Purdue this year? Let's get back to that world. Let's find another Drew Brees for one of these 7 teams, right? Because even Ricky Stanzi, you know what I mean? Let's find it. It doesn't have to be Russell Wilson. It doesn't have to be Drew Brees, but they've got to elevate the quarterback play because this was a little rough searching for the best quarterback in Big Ten West history. All right. Best coach. He's the only coach to make it through his team's entire tenure in the Big Ten West. Only one coach was there all 10 years. Illinois, as we covered before, talked about Illinois, had 4 coaches in the history of the Big Ten West. Nebraska had 4 coaches. Now Matt Rule, before that, Scott Frost, Mike Riley, and Bo Pelini was Nebraska's coach in 2014 in year 1. Purdue had 4 coaches, and I included an interim if they coached more than one game. Ryan Walters, Jeff Brom, Daryl Hazel, and Jared Parker as an interim after Hazel got fired. Wisconsin had 4 coaches: Luke Fickell, Jim Leonard, after Paul Chryst got fired, Paul Chryst, and Gary Anderson. Remember him? Made a Big Ten title game and then was I'm out of here. I don't want to do this anymore. Minnesota had 3: PJ Fleck, Tracy Clays, and Jerry Kill. Northwestern had 2: Pat Fitzgerald and David Braun. And the best coach in the history of the Big Ten West is the only guy who was there the whole time. It's Kirk Ferentz at Iowa. And so, Scott covered this really well. There's a lot of defining things about Kirk Ferentz that is close but no cigar. And the number one defining thing is employing his kid. But now that is over with, I think we have a chance to reevaluate Kirk Ferentz. I think we have a chance to reappreciate Kirk Ferentz. Nobody should feel sorry for Kirk Ferentz because his choices and a bunch of other things, several other things that happened off the field have certainly affected the national view on him. But let's see what Iowa can do in this new world. And that's a new world with no divisions, and it's a new world with no nepotism. So Kirk Ferentz, far and away, the best coach. And again, three Big Ten West titles, pretty good. Kirk Ferentz, best coach in the history of the Big Ten West. Best individual win. Since they didn't get a win in a Big Ten title game, I think it's the win in the regular season that stands the test of time. And I think it's pretty definitively 2018 Purdue over Ohio State. As we said, Ohio State only lost to West teams twice. They lost at Iowa in 2017 when Nate Stanley threw 5 touchdowns, 2 each to Noah Fant, TJ Hawkinson. Josh Jackson, the DB, had 3 picks in that game. Tremendous performance by Iowa in Kinnick Stadium. Everything that Iowa can do to you if you're not careful. So I think that's on the table. But this one, everything that was with the emotion of Tyler Trent and the way Rondale Moore took apart that Ohio State defense that night, It was disappointing that Purdue couldn't build on it the rest of that season, but I think for a snapshot, I think that's the one moment you would take. And again, Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State were all pretty stinking good. And so anytime you could get them, Ohio State was 25-2 against the West. Michigan was 21-5 against the West, and Penn State was 19-8 against the West. So I do think it probably has to be a win over Iowa State or Michigan. And listen, if you are a fan who lived or died with a particular Big Ten West program and you're like, hey, there was this great West battle between these two teams. There were those two. There were. But I think the way for that weekend, the Purdue win over Ohio State sort of captured the imagination of college football that year. I'm going to pick that one. Last one I think is the most interesting one, and this is the best individual team in the history of the Big Ten West. And I will tell you, I went through and just sort of tried to find, we like the FEI ratings from Brian Fremo, which are a good way mathematically to take a lot of things into account. So I went through there and tried to find the Big Ten West teams at the end of the year were ranked in the top 10 in the country. There were only 4 by that metric, and they were all Wisconsin teams. It was 2021 Wisconsin was 9th, 2019 Wisconsin was 5th, 2017 Wisconsin was 7th, and 2016 Wisconsin was 8th. Now, I initially went with 2017 with Wisconsin for this because that team finished 13-1, won a major bowl game, was undefeated going into the Big Ten championship game against Ohio State, was higher ranked than Ohio State, and then didn't get it done. But the thing about that Wisconsin team is that in a lot of ways to me was like a typical Big Ten West team because they didn't play anybody. And so they were undefeated and in the playoff top 4 going into conference championship weekend, but I felt like you still didn't really know much about them. They started 9-0 against unranked teams, and they beat number 25 Iowa and number 19 Michigan, and they beat Minnesota to end the year. Then they were number 3 and played number 8 Ohio State. And then they went to a bowl game. They won the Orange Bowl, but they beat Miami in that game. So I was gonna go there, but then I was like, no, that was almost kind of what was wrong in some ways with the Big Ten West, where even if you had a good team, you weren't sure how good because they weren't getting tested week to week. So the team that I chose instead is 2016 Wisconsin. So 2017 Wisconsin won 13-1. 2016 Wisconsin won 11-3. But here's the thing about 2016 Wisconsin. 2016 Wisconsin played 6 top 10 teams that year, and they went 3-3 against them. 2016 Wisconsin opened with a win over number 5 LSU at Lambeau Field. That's a great way for a Big Ten West team to get respect for the division. You beat LSU to open the year. They then won at number 8 Michigan State. Then they lost at number 4 Michigan. That's back-to-back weeks at Michigan State, at Michigan. They lose 14-7. They're right there with Michigan. Then they lose at home to number 2 Ohio State, 30-23 in overtime. They take Ohio State to overtime in Camp Randall. Then they play number 7 Nebraska. They go to overtime again. They win that game, 23-17. Then they play Penn State in the Big Ten title game. They are leading Penn State at one point 28-7. They blow that lead and lose 38-31. My daughter and I went to that game as fans. It was a great game. It was a super fun game. All these boring defensive games that you sometimes get, that was a shootout. And Penn State and Wisconsin were both really good that year. And so then they went to the Cotton Bowl and beat Western Michigan, who was number 12. So I'm going to take that team because that team won out and proved it, which is maybe what didn't happen often enough in the Big Ten West. You were in your shell. This team got out of its shell and went out and played at that time. They played their 3 East games were against top 10 teams. And then they played the other East top 10 team in the conference title game. So they played the 4 best teams in the East, Michigan State, Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State, all ranked in the top 10. They went 2-2 against them, but the losses were by a touchdown and an overtime. So I'll take that. And listen, that team had TJ Watt. And he had 11.5 sacks, Ryan Ramczyk was an offensive lineman who was an All-American that year. That was pre-Jonathan Taylor. Corey Clement was a leading rusher that year with 1,300 yards. But they really got after you, and I liked that. That to me is an embodiment of what the former Big Ten West teams have to be now. Go out and prove it. So congratulations, 2016 Wisconsin, for being the best team in the history of the Big Ten West. Listen, like 2015 Iowa can make an argument. There's a couple other Wisconsin teams we mentioned there can make an argument. I don't think the Northwestern teams, the two teams that reached the Big Ten title game, are really in that discussion, but I'll land here. So that's our farewell to the Big Ten West. And as I said, goodbye, Brian F. Doing that a lot, but I'm not going to sing the whole thing, but I'm going to give you the chorus. And here's the other thing about Candle in the Wind is that, Elton John's a genius songwriter. Like the lyrics in that don't make any sense with the rhythm of the song. So I'm like trying to sing to the song and he's like jamming in 5-syllable words and acting like it's a 2-syllable word. But I kind of got the chorus down a little bit. So if this is terrible, then Michael just cut it out. So it's like, now I can't remember the chorus part, right? It's about a candle. It's about a candle. It's about Marilyn Monroe. Goodbye, Norma Jean. So it's like, goodbye, Brian F. It seems to me you lived your life like a candle in the wind, right? That's the thing. So here's my farewell to the Big Ten West. It seems to me you lived your life like a conference with the West, never knowing who was mid and maybe who was best. I would have liked to know you, but I was East obsessed. Your division burned out in 2023 after legends and leaders left. That was good, right? Wasn't that good? So it's conference in the West because it's a C and a W word, like candle in the wind. So that's why it worked. And then at the end, the legend never did. And then they named one of the divisions legend before it became West and East. All right. I was asking my kids, you think it could go viral? Like my song, if I put it to a karaoke thing, and my daughter said, well, usually things that go viral like that are good. So it's not going to. Anyway, goodbye. Goodbye. I think many, at least Big Ten fans, will always kind of think of those 7 teams as Big Ten West teams, at least for a little while longer. I'll be very curious maybe when that gets broken and when it's just like, hey, it's just Nebraska and Oregon and Penn State and Ohio State and USC, and they're all the same. They're just in one big conference. But I don't know, at least right now it's like East, West, newbies, and you're in your little group. You're in your clique. So we'll put them in the lunchroom and tell them to all be friends. That always works. All right. Thanks to Scott Dochterman for that great appearance. Super smart. I just think he's a super smart dude. So we loved having him on the show. Make sure you are reading all of his great college football, Big Ten, Iowa coverage at The Athletic. Thanks as always to our producer, Mike Urostowski, for making us look good and sound good. Only show this week. We'll get back at it. Guess what? When we get back at it next week, we'll be in Vegas for Big 12 conference meetings. So get ready for that. College football is right around the corner. For now, I'm Doug Lesmerises, and that was Kings of the North.